Welcome. Close your eyes when you're ready and let the stillness settle over you. Close your eyes and drift with me into the soft, ancient idea of the Great Mother and the soul's deepest roots. If you drift off easily here, subscribe. A new one arrives every night. The lamp on Jung's desk had been burning for some time. Outside the windows of the house at Kusnacht, the lake lay flat and dark, its surface holding the last pale suggestion of a sky that had finished with color hours ago. Jung was not reading. He was looking at a piece of paper that a patient had placed in his hands that afternoon, a drawing made without instruction, without prompt, without any knowledge of what it resembled or what older forms it might be calling back into the world. The paper was thick. The drawing had been made in wax crayon, in colors that had required some deliberate choosing, a deep ochre for the earth, a dark and slightly greenish blue for the water, and for the figure itself, a warmth somewhere between amber and rose that the patient had arrived at by layering one color slowly over another. The figure rose from the water. It was vast. It was female. Its arms were open in a gesture that was not quite welcoming and not quite releasing, but somewhere in the long space between those two things. And its face, if it had a face, was turned slightly upward, as if attending to something that came from above the edge of the paper. Jung sat with it for a long time. The house was very quiet. What he was feeling was not surprise exactly. It was the particular quality of recognition that comes when something you have been thinking carefully about for years announces itself not as a conclusion, but as a presence. The drawing was the presence. The patient had never read the mythology. The patient had never seen the goddess figurines. The patient had simply gone home the previous evening and, without knowing why, had sat down and made this. There is a word for what Jung had built his life's work around finding, archetypes, but the word, like most technical terms, does the concept a slight disservice when encountered before the experience it names. What the word is trying to hold is this, that certain shapes of experience, certain organizing patterns in the way the human mind perceives, feels, and understands, do not arrive in a person through learning or inheritance or cultural transmission alone. They are there before the teaching begins. They are structural. They are, in a sense, that Jung spent decades trying to make philosophically precise, inherited, not as memories, not as ideas, but as dispositions of the psyche, as grooves worn in the substance of the human mind by the long, unbroken pressure of the same experiences repeated across uncountable generations. The infant that has never seen a predator can still be frightened in a way that resembles the shape of the fear. The child that has never heard of paradise can still dream a garden. The adult who has never encountered the mythology can still, in an afternoon of unguided drawing, produce a figure rising from dark water with its arms spread open. Jung had come to this understanding slowly, and not without considerable resistance from the more empirical edges of the psychology that surrounded him. He had separated with considerable pain from Freud, whose own mapping of the unconscious had been confined to the personal layer, the domain of repressed memories, suppressed desires, the biographical residue of a single life's experience. Freud's unconscious was deep, but it was bounded. It was, at its limit, still the unconscious of one person, shaped by one history. What Jung had begun to find, in the dreams and drawings and spontaneous visions of his patients, was something beneath that personal layer, something that did not belong to any individual life, but appeared to be shared, in its broad structural outlines, across individuals who had no knowledge of one another, across cultures that had developed in complete geographic separation, across centuries that had no means of communication between them. A different word was needed for this deeper stratum. Jung called it the collective unconscious, not the private cellar of one life, but the bedrock beneath all cellars, the shared interior of the species, older than any single memory it might contain. The collective unconscious does not present itself as a statement. It does not communicate in the way a thought communicates, arriving with grammar and sequence and the clear shape of an intention. It communicates the way weather communicates, as pressure, as shift, as the feeling that something in the surrounding atmosphere has changed before any change is visible. Jung described it as a stratum populated not by individual memories, but by archetypes, and the archetypes function less like inhabitants of a space and more like the space's own organizing structure, the pattern according to which the space arranges whatever enters it. Every human experience that is universal enough, that has been repeated across enough generations, in enough cultures, has left its corresponding archetypal shape in this shared interior: the trickster, the wise old man, the child, the hero, and beneath all of them, older than all of them, foundational in a way that is not merely symbolic, but structural, the Great Mother. She is not a goddess in the sense that requires a name, a theology, a particular cultural address. She is the psychic image of origin itself. She is the felt quality of the ground from which individual existence arises and toward which it perpetually inclines. She is what a person moves toward in the dark of a dream, when the dream has the quality of something old and receiving and without edge. Jung had found her in the patient's drawing that afternoon, and he had found her before that in other drawings, other dreams, other spontaneous productions of patients who had no mythological education to draw on, and yet had drawn on something deeper and more durable than education. The wax crayon figure rising from the water was not a product of that particular person's life history. It was a product of something the person carried, that was not personal, that was not earned, that had been there long before the crayon was picked up. To understand what kind of thing the Great Mother is as an archetype, it helps to understand first what Jung thought the two layers of the unconscious were doing. The personal unconscious holds what a single life has experienced, and pushed below the threshold of waking awareness, the forgotten, the suppressed, the accumulated residue of a particular history. This layer is real and consequential, and the therapeutic work of uncovering it matters, but it is bounded. It has a floor, and at that floor, the personal unconscious opens into something else, something that has no floor, something that is not one person's but everyone's, the collective unconscious, the shared stratum, the place where the drawing comes from when no one told the hand what to draw. The collective unconscious is a kind of depth that individual awareness floats on without ever, in most circumstances, touching. The boundary between waking consciousness and this depth is maintained by what Jung called the ego, the organizing center of conscious identity, the thing that knows its own name and its own history and holds its own continuity from day to day. The ego manages the boundary. It keeps the depths from flooding the surface. It is responsible, in the most literal sense, for the coherent self that wakes each morning and knows where it is. But the ego did not make itself. The ego arose from something. It emerged in the course of development, both individual and evolutionary, from a state prior to its own formation, a state that was undifferentiated and boundless, and in which the boundary between self and world, between inner and outer, did not yet exist. That prior state is what the Great Mother archetype names. She is the matrix from which the ego is born. She is not behind consciousness in the way that a past moment is behind a present one. She is beneath it, continuously, as the ocean floor is beneath the water rather than behind it, still present, still extensive, still exerting its pressure from below, even when the surface has entirely forgotten it. It is a surface. There is a second archetype that must be understood alongside the Great Mother, and that archetype is called the anima. Jung used the word carefully, with its Latin sense intact. Anima means soul, or breath, or that which animates, and he meant by it the inner feminine soul image that mediates between the ego and the deeper layers of the unconscious. For Jung, the anima is a structural feature of the psyche, not a personal acquisition. She appears in dreams as a woman who is somehow known beyond what the dream could account for, familiar in the way that something deeply remembered feels familiar rather than merely recognized. She appears in mythology as the goddess, the siren, the muse, the guide who leads the traveler through the underworld and waits, patient and necessary, at the boundary between what can be seen and what lies beyond it. She appears in fairy tales as the figure who holds the key, who knows the forest, who can speak to the parts of the world that do not respond to direct address. And in all these appearances, she serves the same mediating function. She is the figure who can move between the ego's daylit world and the depths that lie beneath it, who carries messages from the depths in the language of image and feeling rather than argument and word. And what lies at the source of all her forms, the ground from which she perpetually arises, is the Great Mother archetype herself. The anima, in all her variations, beautiful or terrible, beckoning or withdrawing, serene or turbulent, is a daughter of the maternal ground. Every form she takes in the imagination is a modulation of the original figure, the vast and receiving and ultimately undifferentiated matrix that precedes all form. To follow the anima back through her mythological appearances, through goddess and guide and muse and queen of the dead, is to follow a thread back toward an origin that does not present itself as a figure at all, but is the condition in which figures become possible. The darkness before the first image, the water before the first shape. The anima is the Great Mother made mobile, made mediating, made available to the individual psyche as a guide between the known and the unknown. But the Great Mother herself does not move. She is the ground, the standing figure at the edge of the forest at dusk. This is the anima, as Jung's patients encountered her most often in their dreams, and as Jung himself described her in his private journals, the figure he called his own soul image, the voice that arrived in the half-waking dark and spoke in a register that was not thought, but was not quite feeling either. She stands at the edge where the cultivated land ends and the forest begins, where the illuminated and the unilluminated meet. Her face has the quality of something deeply familiar, seen for the first time, not strange, not foreign, but somehow more itself than anything encountered in ordinary waking life. She does not speak first. She waits. She is present in the way that the question before it is asked is present, already active, and already structuring the silence, without having yet taken a form. Jung wrote about her with a care that stopped just short of naming what he was doing, which was acknowledging that the deepest layer of his own psyche had a face, and that the face was feminine, and that the feminine had a source older and more vast than any individual encounter with any particular woman could account for. What makes the Great Mother archetype philosophically difficult and philosophically necessary in equal measure is that she is not simply benevolent. This is perhaps the most important thing Jung said about her, and the most important thing to sit with, rather than move past. She does not divide neatly into a good figure and a threatening one, with the goodness being the real her and the threat being a distortion or corruption. Both poles are equally herself. Both belong to the archetype's inherent and necessary structure. The nourishing mother, who shelters and feeds and holds and warms, and the devouring mother, who pulls back, consumes, and dissolves. These are not opposites arranged against each other in a moral drama. They are the two faces of a single form, the two coasts of a single body of water, a warm cove where small boats sit in sheltered stillness, the water barely moving, the light gathered and held. A headland where the open sea meets stone with a force that does not adjust itself to the scale of human presence, where the waves break not out of malice, but out of the indifferent momentum of something vast following its own law. The cove and the headland belong to the same sea. The sea does not choose between its faces. The sea simply is what it is, in both of them at once, and what it is includes both the shelter and the exposure, both the stillness and the break. Jung regarded this ambivalence not as a psychological problem to be resolved, but as a structural fact to be understood. The archetype's power, the reason it organizes so much of human experience across so many cultures, comes precisely from its wholeness, from the fact that it holds these two poles together rather than resolving them into one. A purely nourishing mother would be, philosophically, an incomplete symbol. It would leave half of human experience unaddressed. The experience of dissolution, of return, of the ending of individual form back into the formless ground from which it arose. What the Great Mother symbol holds is the full cycle, emergence, sustenance, and return, birth, life, and the dissolution that makes the next birth possible. The psyche needs an image that contains the entire cycle, not just the half of it that the ego finds comfortable. The Great Mother contains it. That is her function. That is why she is ancient, why she is everywhere, why she persists. Erich Neumann was a German-Israeli psychologist, a student of Jung's who worked in Tel Aviv through the late 1940s and early 1950s. And in 1955, he published the book that remains the most sustained attempt to map the archetype across the full range of its historical appearances. The title was simply and comprehensively stated, *The Great Mother*. Neumann was working in a specific set of conditions that shaped his thinking in ways that are visible in the book, but rarely discussed alongside it. He had left Germany in 1934, a year after the political changes that made intellectual life there untenable for him, and he had built his career in a country that was itself new, finding its form, asking foundational questions about what cultural continuity means when the continuity has been violently interrupted. These circumstances gave Neumann's thinking about origins and about the psyche's need for a maternal ground a particular urgency that the academic tone of the book holds, with some effort, at a professional distance. The method Neumann used was to gather. He spread across the wide table of the book's pages an astonishing range of visual material: Paleolithic carved figurines, Egyptian votive objects, Minoan painted vessels, Sumerian cylinder seals, African ritual masks, pre-Columbian clay figures, and he arranged this material not chronologically and not geographically, but according to what he took to be the psychological logic of the archetype itself. The book is structured around two axes. The first axis is what Neumann called the elementary character of the archetype, its static, containing, holding quality, the mother as vessel, as matrix, as the stable ground from which life emerges. The second axis is what he called the transformative character, the dynamic, dissolving, renewing quality, the mother as the force that breaks down fixed forms in order to make new ones possible. These two axes cross each other, and in their crossing, they produce the full range of the archetype's appearances across human symbolic history. The argument Neumann was building from this material was larger than any single cultural example could support. He was arguing that the entire arc of human psychological development, from the undifferentiated pre-egoic state of earliest infancy through the long struggle to establish a coherent individual identity, and then in maturity, the movement toward what Jung called individuation, recapitulates in the life of a single person a narrative that has been playing out at the level of the species since the beginning of human consciousness. In this narrative, the ego emerges from the maternal unconscious, the way a figure emerges from dark water, pushing upward against a pressure that is not hostile, but is simply the natural tendency of the undifferentiated to remain undifferentiated. The ego's task in the middle phase of this narrative is to establish itself against this pull, to maintain its distinct form against the constant background pressure of the maternal ground that produced it and perpetually solicits its return. And in the final phase, not an ending, but a transformation, the mature ego finds a way to turn back toward the maternal unconscious, not to be dissolved by it, but to be in conscious relationship with it, to carry its depths without losing its form, to hold the paradox that the greatest individual development includes rather than excludes the archaic ground of all development. This was the philosophical argument that the photographs of ancient goddess figurines were being asked to carry on Neumann's wide Tel Aviv table, a Paleolithic carved stone from Central Europe, a carved ivory woman from a site in Germany dating to tens of thousands of years before any surviving writing, a terracotta vessel shaped in the form of a female body from a Mediterranean civilization that had long since lost its language, each object placed beside the others in a slow visual argument that the psyche has always known this form, has always returned to it, has always needed it, as the image of the ground from which everything else emerges. The objects were not placed as evidence for a historical belief that could be then dated and contextualized. They were placed as evidence for a psychological structure that the historical beliefs were expressions of, the structure being the archetype, the expressions being as varied as the cultures that had produced them, and as convergent as the single psychic form. They were all in their different materials and different centuries, reaching toward. The anima appears at the edge of the forest at dusk, and behind her the forest continues farther than the eye can follow, and beyond the forest is something else entirely, something that has no edge. And this is where the individual thread of the Great Mother's influence in any single life eventually opens into the larger claim. The archetype is not a metaphor. This is the hardest thing to hold while keeping both philosophy and science in view. But it is what Jung was insisting on, and what Neumann's patient gathering of objects was meant to demonstrate. The Great Mother is not a symbol that represents a reality that exists elsewhere, in some more literal form. The archetype is its own kind of reality, a structural feature of the shared human interior, as objective in its effects as any external feature of the world. When the drawing patient arrived with the wax crayon figure, something happened in Jung's understanding that was not the recognition of a symbol pointing to a real thing, but the recognition of the real thing itself, operating in the ordinary life of an ordinary person who had no idea it was there. The thing was there. It had always been there. The patient had not found it. The patient had been found. Outside the house at Kusnacht, the lake moved in the darkness with its own unhurried logic. Jung had chosen the lake deliberately when he settled there, had built his house in a relationship to the water that his writing returns to many times without ever quite explaining, as if the reasons for proximity to water were felt rather than reasoned, and therefore resisted the kind of articulation that reasons respond to. Water in Jung's symbolic language carries the same resonance it carries in the archetype's oldest appearances. It is the primary image of the unconscious, formless, all-encompassing, the medium in which distinct forms arise and dissolve, the surface of which reflects the sky, while the depths remain unlit, unvisited, continuous with the bed of the earth. The lake outside the study was not a symbol for the collective unconscious. The lake was simply a lake, and the collective unconscious was simply the collective unconscious, and they shared a quality that the mind naturally perceives as related, the quality of being what everything else floats on, the quality of having depths that have nothing to do with what is happening at the surface, the quality of a pressure that is not insistent, but is simply always present, beneath and surrounding and continuous. The drawing lay on the desk. The lamp continued to burn. The figure in the drawing continued to rise from its dark water, with its arms at the angle between offering and releasing, its face turned slightly up, its entire form composed from the marks of a hand that had not known what it was doing, and had, in not knowing, done something remarkable. What had spoken through the patient's hand was older than the patient, older than the psychology that would eventually name it, older than any of the written traditions that the next several decades of scholarship would draw on to give it historical address. It was the archetype making itself felt in the only way it ever makes itself felt, as image, as presence, as the recognition in the beholder that something has been located that was not lost but was simply below the range of ordinary attention. Jung sat with this understanding for a long time. The house was very quiet. Somewhere, well below the surface of his own thoughts, the depths continued in their slow and ancient work, as they always had, as they always do, in the life of every person who has ever drawn a figure from a darkness they could not name and found it, without understanding how, exact. The collective unconscious does not sleep. This is the thought that stays when the lamp is finally turned down, and the drawings are set aside, and the philosopher who has been sitting with them moves away from the desk toward rest. All the activity of conscious life, the arguing, the explaining, the careful construction of theories, and the equally careful dismantling of them, takes place against a background that is not diminished by any of it, that was not present only for the duration of the thinking, and will not be absent after the thinking stops. The depths are not waiting for the surface to quiet down so that something can be attended to. The depths are simply there, as they have always been, below the surface movements of waking thought and sleeping thought alike, holding whatever arises from them, the way the ocean floor holds the water above it, without effort, without intention, without any need for the surface to know what holds it. The drawing was made from there. The drawing returned to there when it was set down. And the stillness that a person finds at the edge of sleep, the particular quality of openness that precedes the dissolution of ordinary waking awareness, is not an emptiness that opens as consciousness withdraws. It is the return of awareness to the ground it has always been resting on. The slow, unhurried recognition that the depth was present all along, beneath every thought that thought it was operating alone, beneath every image that believed itself to be a beginning rather than an emergence from something older and darker and more vast than any single figure rising in wax crayon from a lake that does not sleep. A curator at the British Museum lifts a clay tablet from its archival housing with both hands, the way one carries something that has traveled an enormous distance to arrive in this room. The tablet is small enough to hold in cupped palms. Its surface is the color of dried earth after rain, pale ochre, with a texture between rough and smooth that no ceramic made today quite replicates. Under the low, careful light, arranged to bring the inscriptions forward without damaging the clay. The pressed marks of a reed stylus become visible as shallow grooves, each one made in a single deliberate motion by a hand that has been dust for 5,000 years. In those grooves, arranged in the dense, wedge-shaped script that took scholars centuries to read again, is the name Nin Herseg, Lady of the Sacred Mountain, the oldest written name for the Mother of the World. What the curator holds is not the original impression of the thought. The thought is older. The thought was already ancient when the scribe first pressed those signs into wet clay, already carried in bodies and spoken in mouths and drawn in forms that have not survived the long weight of time. Writing fixed what memory had already been keeping, and the name that appears in that clay was a name the world had needed for longer than any record can confirm. The tablet makes the name permanent in a way that memory cannot, but the need that produced the name is older than both. Nimerseg appears in Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, counted among the 7 supreme deities of the Sumerian pantheon, a number that placed her in the innermost ring of cosmic authority. Her name changed across the centuries and across regions, carrying different epithets in different cities, called at different times by different titles, that each reached toward the same essential presence. Lady of the Sacred Mountain was one, Mother of the Gods was another, Nurturer of Kings a third. The names changed because no single name was quite large enough, and so the tradition kept offering new ones, the way a person might offer multiple descriptions of something they can see clearly, but cannot reduce to a single phrase. She was the fertile earth understood as a body. She was the ground from which all living things grew, and to which all living things returned. Her iconography encoded the uterus, the nursing breast, the sheltering soil, not as symbols requiring interpretation, but as direct statements about what the sacred source of life looked like when it took form. Theologians in ancient Sumer were not making metaphors. They were describing what they took to be the actual structure of the world, a world in which the earth was not a passive surface, but an active, nourishing, generative body. When they wrote the signs for her name in clay, they were not inventing a poetic figure. They were naming a power they believed existed, whose existence explained why the fields yielded grain, why ewes bore lambs, why the flooding river deposited the rich, dark silt from which another year's food would grow. The name carried ontological weight. Pressing it into clay was not a literary act, but something closer to what a later tradition would call theology, the careful, considered articulation of the ground of being, as the cuneiform stylus knew how to articulate it. The reed stylus makes a particular sound against soft clay, a quiet resistance, then a give, then the pressed groove holds its shape as the tool is drawn across the surface. Every sign requires its own angle, its own pressure, its own specific motion, learned over years of practice. A scribe working by lamplight in a temple precinct 3,000 years before the Common Era, forming the signs for a goddess's name on a document that recorded the distribution of grain from a temple storehouse, was performing a liturgical act as much as an administrative one. The name appeared at the head of the document because the distribution it recorded was, in a sense, her activity, the earth providing, the storehouse holding, the temple administering what the Great Mother had given. Her name was not decoration, it was attribution. Isis arrived later in the written record, or at least in the record that survives. The pre-dynastic period in Egypt extends back before the hieroglyphic system had become the tool capable of capturing theological nuance, and what the people of that earlier time believed about the great feminine power their descendants would name Isis can only be inferred from what came after. By the time the written record is clear, she is already ancient, known in Egyptian as Aset, meaning throne. She was already theologically sophisticated, not a simple deity of a single force, but a figure of cosmic comprehension, mistress of magic, keeper of the secret name of Ra, a goddess whose power extended through every domain because she was understood as the principle of integration itself, the intelligence that gathers, holds, and gives form to what would otherwise disperse. The myth of Osiris and Isis, in the versions that have come down through papyri and carved temple walls, and the later accounts of writers who encountered the tradition when it had already crossed the Mediterranean, turns on a gathering. Osiris is dismembered and scattered. The pieces are distributed across the land of Egypt, each fragment hidden in a different place. The coherent body, broken into parts no single location can hold. What Isis does in response is search. She travels to each place. She finds each fragment. With intelligence and with what the texts call the power of her magic, a word that, in its Egyptian form, carried something closer to the meaning of skilled, directed, transformative attention, she gathers the scattered pieces and from them, through her own labor and knowledge, reconstitutes the body that had been broken. The soul of Osiris does not stay lost. The dead god does not remain merely dead. What the myth describes at its most direct is the capacity of a divine feminine intelligence to make whole what dissolution has broken, to find even in the most dispersed, most defeated, most thoroughly destroyed condition the materials for reconstruction. For nearly 3,000 years, from the pre-dynastic period through the first centuries of the Common Era, when the temples of Isis were still active while Christianity was establishing itself across the Roman world, her worship continued without interruption. Temples were built to her across Egypt, then across the Mediterranean world as her cult traveled with traders and soldiers and sailors. Her image appeared on carved walls in Egypt and on painted panels in Roman Italy and on amulets worn by people who believed she would protect them because she had demonstrated, in the most literal sense available to theological conviction, that her devotion to those she loved was without limit, and her power to restore what had been lost was real. When the late classical historian Apuleius set his novel at Isis's feet in the 2nd century of the Common Era, he was not writing about a quaint remnant of an older age. The goddess to whom his narrator prostrates himself was in that moment the center of a living tradition that had already outlasted every political configuration the ancient world had seen come and go. There is something in the persistence of her worship that the historical record shows without quite explaining. Traditions rise and fall, cults emerge, flourish, and disappear when the conditions that supported them change. Isis did not disappear when conditions changed. She adapted. When Alexander's successors ruled Egypt, her theology absorbed Greek philosophical categories without losing its Egyptian center. When Rome became the dominant power, her temples were built in Rome itself, on the Capitoline Hill, in the shadow of the Roman state's own sacred sites. The tradition that carries her name spans a longer continuous period of active worship than almost any other in the ancient world, which is not the same as proving her existence, but is a fact about the human need that her image was answering, a need that proved across millennia to be reliably present. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, a Phrygian goddess crossed the Mediterranean on a Roman ship and was received in the city of Rome with unusual formal ceremony. The Sibylline books had been consulted. The oracles had been interpreted as directing Rome to seek the mother of the gods, Cybele, whose primary sanctuary stood in Phrygia, in what is now western Turkey, and to bring her to the city. What arrived was a sacred black stone, understood as the goddess's presence in portable form, carried from her mountain sanctuary at Pessinus to the port at Ostia, and then upriver to Rome, where it was installed on the Palatine Hill and housed in a temple dedicated to the Magna Mater, the Great Mother. The year was 204 before the Common Era. Rome was at war with Carthage, and the city had been told that the goddess's presence would turn the tide. The tile turned. Whether the connection between Cybele's arrival and Rome's eventual victory was causal or coincidental is not a question the ancient sources were equipped to ask in the way a later historical method would ask it. What the sources record is the sequence of events and the theological interpretation the city placed on that sequence. The Great Mother had been brought to Rome. Rome had prevailed. The worship of Cybele took root in the city and persisted for centuries, generating a mystery cult whose initiatory practices enacted something that later philosophical language would call mystical death and rebirth. Those who entered the innermost rites of Sabai's worship were led through an experience, the exact details of which the initiated kept from the uninitiated, as mystery traditions do, that was understood as dying within the body of the Great Mother and being reconstituted by her, emerging as a person who had passed through dissolution and returned changed. The theological argument implicit in the rite was this: that transformation which reaches all the way down requires a willingness to be unmade, that the self which emerges from genuine encounter with the maternal power is not the same self that entered, that the Great Mother does not merely comfort, she remakes. The drums that accompanied Cybele's rites were not ornamental, they were a technology. The rhythm entered the body before the mind had decided how to receive it, overriding the ordinary modulation of waking consciousness and carrying the worshipper into a state that the rites then shaped. Those who moved through the torchlit streets of 2nd century Rome toward the Palatine Hill on the days of her festival heard the drums from a distance first, felt them as a pressure in the chest before they could be distinguished as music, and understood this pressure as her approach rather than their own arrival. The body's response to the sound came first. The theological interpretation of that response came after. This ordering was not accidental. It was in its way philosophically precise, the teaching that the Great Mother is encountered in the body's own depths before she is understood in the mind. On the far side of the world, in the tradition that developed across the Indian subcontinent across many centuries, a different vocabulary was used to point towards something whose essential structure carries remarkable continuity with what the name Cybele carried in Rome, and the name Isis carried in Alexandria, and the name Ninhursag carried in Sumer. Shakti, in the philosophical framework of the Shakta traditions, is not a deity worshipped in addition to the real structure of the cosmos. She is the real structure of the cosmos, the primordial, self-luminous, beginningless creative power whose movement constitutes all of existence, and whose stillness, if it were ever to obtain, would dissolve the world not into nothingness, but into herself. The Devi Mahatmya, composed perhaps in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era and incorporated into the larger Markandeya Purana, opens with a theological claim that does not soften its scope. The goddess described in its verses is not a personification of a force. She is the force. The distinction matters enormously. A personification is a poetic convenience, a way of giving face and story to something that could in principle be described without a face. The goddess described in the Devi Mahatmya is not that. She is the prior ontological condition, the ground that makes all subsequent description possible, including the description of herself. The Sanskrit philosophical traditions developed very precise language for this priority, and the language points towards something that neither Greek nor modern European philosophical vocabulary has quite found an adequate term for, a condition in which the feminine is not secondary to the masculine, not derived from a prior masculine principle, not the passive receptacle into which an active male force pours form, but the generative ground itself, self-luminous, self-sufficient, the source from which all subsequent distinctions, including the distinction between masculine and feminine, arise. The Lalita Sahasranama, the 1,000 names of the goddess Lalita, composed within the Shakta tradition and recited by practitioners as a complete act of worship in itself, enumerates 1,000 aspects of this single primordial power. Each name is a different angle on the same inexhaustible reality. She who is the source of creation, and she who is the dissolution of creation, and she who remains unchanged through both. These are not contradictions, but the natural consequence of describing something whose scope is larger than the categories used to describe it. Any single name reaches toward her and stops short, which is why the tradition requires 1,000, and why even 1,000 is understood as approximate rather than complete. The act of reciting the names is itself the worship, not because the recitation informs the goddess of her own qualities, but because the sustained, attentive movement through 1,000 names is what sustained, attentive approach to the inexhaustible looks like in practice. In a South Indian temple at dawn, the stone interior still cool from the night, the recitation of those Sanskrit syllables fills the space in a way that practitioners describe not as a sound produced by human voices, but as the space itself, vibrating in its own register. The carved walls receive the sound and return it slightly altered, the reverberations layering over each other, so that what is heard in any given moment is not a single utterance, but an accumulation, the syllable from a moment ago still present in the air as the next syllable arrives. The temple was built to create exactly this acoustic condition. The architects who designed its proportions were working with the same theological conviction that animated the text being recited within it, that the goddess inhabits space itself, that her presence is not brought to the temple from outside, but is what the temple, correctly built and correctly used, allows to become perceptible. The recitation that has been performed in that space for 15 centuries is in this understanding not a remembering of something absent, but an act of recognition, acknowledging what is already present, has always been present, in the warm stone and the dark space, and the air that carries the breath of those who have been breathing in that same darkness, generation after generation, reaching for the same inexhaustible name. What the textual traditions, Sumerian, Egyptian, Phrygian, Indian, have in common is not the specific forms they give to the feminine power they address. The forms differ enormously. Nin-Her-Sag is not Isis, who is not Cybele, who is not Shakti, and the traditions that produced each figure developed in relative independence of one another, using different languages, different cosmological frameworks, different theories of the soul's nature and the world's origin. What they share is the recognition that the source of existence has a quality that their different vocabularies all describe with feminine terms, a quality of encompassing, generating, sustaining, receiving, and remaking, a quality that is prior to any distinction between creator and creature, a quality that the human psyche appears, independently and across vast distances, to have reached for with the same gesture, using whatever language it had available. Before any of those texts were written, before any of the named traditions had produced the theological frameworks that gave Ning-Her-Sag her name, or Isis her myth, or Cybele her drums, or Shakti her 1,000 names, human hands were shaping stone. They were shaping small objects, portable enough to hold in one hand, carved with care that required significant skill and significant time. What those hands were making has survived in quantities sufficient to constitute a pattern, not a single object or a pair of objects, but thousands of them, distributed across a geographic range that extends from the Atlantic coast of Western Europe through the plains of Central Europe into Siberia, spanning at least 25,000 years of continuous or near-continuous production. Each object was made differently. Different hands, different stone, different stylistic choices, different degrees of surface detail, and yet, examined as a group, they converge on a form so consistently that the convergence itself requires explanation. The form is rounded, the hips are large, the abdomen is full, sometimes suggesting pregnancy, sometimes not clearly so, but always suggesting fullness rather than attenuation. The breasts are emphasized. The arms, when present, are small and secondary. The head, when it exists as a distinct feature, is often faceless, or given only the most minimal differentiation from the rounded mass of the upper body. The legs, where present, taper toward the lower end in a way that suggests something rooted rather than ambulatory, planted rather than walking. These figures do not look like portraits of specific individuals. They do not look like the kind of representation produced by an artist trying to capture the appearance of a particular person observed in the world. They look like ideas given form, like the attempt to express, in a medium that the hand can shape and the eye can hold, something that exists in a dimension prior to the particular. A figurine from the Gravettian period, carved between 25 and 30,000 years ago, rests in a glass case in a European museum and has accumulated, over the centuries since its discovery, more interpretations than it could possibly have been intended to hold. Scholars have called it a fertility symbol, a goddess image, a self-portrait by a female artist, an amuletic object, a teaching device, a portable shrine. Each interpretation says something about the figure and says something about the moment in which the interpretation was made. The figure itself says nothing, which is part of what makes it so durable as an object of attention. It holds its shape. The enormous hips and the full abdomen and the faceless head, tilted slightly downward, persist unchanged, whether the scholar looking at it in this century thinks it represents a goddess or not. The stone has its own patience. It has been holding this form for 30,000 years, which is longer than any interpretation of it has yet managed to hold its ground. What can be said, with the care that the archaeological record supports, is that human beings of the Paleolithic period were making these objects, that they were making them consistently across enormous distances and time spans, and that the form they chose to make across those distances and time spans emphasizes the aspects of the female body most directly associated with the generation and nourishment of life. That this emphasis is consistent across objects separated by geography and millennia is not coincidence in any ordinary sense of the word. It is pattern, and what the pattern indicates, held at the careful distance of what the evidence can responsibly support, is that the human psyche was drawn very early and very persistently to the specific formal qualities of the female body as a way of thinking about or reaching toward the source from which life springs. Whether the people who made those figures would have understood themselves as worshiping a goddess is a question no one can answer with confidence. The interior life of a Paleolithic carver is not available to reconstruction in the way that the interior of a figure is available to measurement and formal description. What the record gives is objects, not intentions. What the objects show is a consistent formal choice. made independently across a vast canvas of human experience, about which aspects of the world were important enough to be given durable form in stone. The nourishing, generating, encompassing body of the feminine appears across that canvas as one of the most persistently important. It was given form before writing existed to give it name. It was shaped before the traditions that would eventually name it had any of the theological vocabulary those names would carry. The names came later: Nanghersog, Isis, Cybele, Shakti. Each one arrived when a tradition had developed language sophisticated enough to articulate what the form had already been expressing in stone. The form came first. The need that produced the form came first still, and the need, the evidence suggests, is among the oldest and most reliably human of all the needs that have left their marks on the world. The need to acknowledge the source, to give it shape, to hold it in the hands, to carry it through the dark geography of the prehistoric world as something portable, something present, something that could be touched. Across western France and southern Germany, in the vast middle plains of Europe, and into the cold Siberian distance, in the different colored stone available in each region, limestone and ivory, and hematite and soft schist, different hands were making the same essential gesture. The gesture was not copying. There is no evidence of a single original that all the subsequent figures were attempting to reproduce. The convergence was not the result of a tradition that spread outward from one point and carried its form with it. It was the result of independent arrivals at the same recognition, the same answer reached from different starting points, in different languages of stone, under different skies, separated by distances that no one of that era would have been able to travel and survive. That kind of convergence, reached independently across such distances and such time, is what a pattern in the deepest sense looks like. It is not the repetition of a single cultural form passed from hand to hand. It is the recurring manifestation of something that human attention turned toward the mystery of its own origin and the mystery of the source from which all living things emerge, repeatedly discovers the rounded form, the generous body, the faceless head tilted slightly downward, as if the figure is attending to something the viewer cannot see, shaped in limestone in the Perigord, shaped in ivory in Moravia, shaped in schist in the Don Valley, each one different in surface, in size, in the specific disposition of the available material, each one recognizable across all those differences as reaching toward the same essential presence. The Venus of Willendorf, the Venus of Dolny Vestonice, the Venus of Lossel, with her hand raised to hold a bison horn carved with 13 marks. Each figure rests now in a museum case under glass in careful light, attended by small printed cards that explain what is known about its age, its material, its provenance. The cards are accurate as far as they go. They give the information the record can support. What they cannot give, because it is not information, but something else, is the quality of attention that shaped each figure, the hours of careful work, the sustained focus on a form that mattered enough to spend those hours on, the decision to shape this particular aspect of the world in durable stone rather than leaving it in the impermanence of paint or wood or breath. The stone chose to last. The hand that worked, it chose what the stone would hold. Across 30,000 years of that choosing, across distances vast enough that no individual life could traverse them, the choosing kept arriving at the same form. The curator sets the clay tablet back in its archival housing with both hands, the same care with which it was lifted. The lights are adjusted. The tablet returns to its controlled darkness. The name in the clay remains visible for a moment After the careful light is withdrawn, the shallow grooves holding their shape in the dimmer air, and then the darkness closes around them, and the name is present without being seen, the way it was present for far longer than it was visible, carried in the bodies and the mouths and the needs of the people who spoke it before anyone thought to press it into permanent clay. Far back across the long map of the prehistoric world, in the cold light and the firelight and the darkness of the places where the figurines were made and held, and perhaps carried from place to place in the hands of people moving across an unmapped landscape, the rounded forms sat in the dark and held their shape. Different stone, different hands, different skies pressing down on different portions of the vast continent where the human animal was slowly making its long home. The same full hips, the same full belly, the same slight downward tilt of the faceless head, the same quiet recognition, shaped in stone, carried through the dark, that the source of life has a body, that the ground from which everything arises and to which everything returns has a form the hands already know even before the mind has found the words. Hesiod stood in an open field in Boeotia, and the night was very old around him. The stars were out in the particular density they reach when there is no moon and the eye has had time to adjust, and he was speaking. His lips moved through the lines of a poem he was composing by memory and mouth together, the way that oral poetry was always composed, not written down but built up, shaped and reshaped in the movement of breath across an evening, a season, a lifetime of evenings. The words he was finding that night were about the beginning of things, about the moment before there was a moment, and the image they kept returning to was not a god who made the world from nothing, not a craftsman who fashioned order from chaos, but a body that opened and gave what it contained. Gaia was the word his lips made, the earth, the ground beneath the open field where he stood. In the poem he was assembling the one that would be called the asterisk theogony. Asterisk, the generation of the gods, chaos came first, a vast and unnamed darkness, and from it Gaia arose. Not as a creation, not as a product, she arose the way something arises from itself, already whole, already capable, already carrying within her the full weight of what would come next. She did not require another. She opened, and from that opening came the sky, the sea, the mountains, the dim underworld below the roots of everything. Before there were gods who governed the world, there was a body that constituted it. The poem was a philosophical claim expressed as genealogy, dressed as myth, spoken aloud in the dark by a man who felt the earth beneath his feet and did not think of it as merely ground. This is where Western philosophy's oldest question about origin begins, not in a seminar room, not in a text with footnotes, but in a field at night and in the mouth of a poet who understood that the first and deepest thing is not a principle, but a presence. The asterisk theogony, asterisk arrived in a world that did not yet have the word philosophy, but the argument it was making would occupy philosophers for the next 3,000 years. What is the ground of all things? What does it mean for things to arise from something prior to themselves? And what is the nature of that prior thing? Hesiod's answer was Gaia. She was not, in his account, a goddess who presided over the earth from somewhere else. She was not a personification of a force that existed independently. She was the earth, the source, the body out of which everything that is had come, and the body into which everything that is would one day return. The poem is precise on this point, in the way that philosophical precision looks when it has not yet separated itself from poetry. Gaia generates, Gaia holds, Gaia endures beneath every change. She is not a deity who can be propitiated or offended, and who might therefore withhold. She is the condition of there being anything at all. What Hesiod could not have known, standing in that field, was that the site closest to him, that was associated with Gaia, was also among the most famous in the ancient world, Delphi, the oracle, the place where the Greeks went to ask their hardest questions and receive answers they would spend years interpreting. The tradition attached to that site held that before Apollo claimed it, before the great temple was built, before the Pythia sat on her tripod and breathed the vapors and spoke in riddles, Delphi had belonged to Gaia. The oracle had been hers. The wisdom that flowed from the earth's interior had been the earth's own voice. Apollo had come later, had taken the site, had given it an architecture of reason and light and civic order, but the original consultation had been with the ground itself, with the feminine depth that preceded the bright god of reason, with the source that preceded its own articulation. That transition from an earth oracle to a sun god's temple carried a philosophical story inside it. The older story said that the wisdom that matters most rises from below, from the dark interior of something vast and maternal, and must be listened for rather than demanded. The later stories said that wisdom could be organized, housed, consulted in an orderly civic fashion by people with specific questions who needed specific answers. Both stories were told at the same location. They were both true of the same hillside above the Gulf of Corinth. What changed was not the place, but the relationship to the depth that spoke from it. Hesiod, composing his poem in the dark, was still in the first story. The poets who worked with Gaia handed a problem to the philosophers who came after them. The problem was this: if everything arises from a single source, what is the nature of that source? The poets had called it Gaia, the earth, the body. The philosophers, beginning in the 6th century BCE, began to ask the same question in a different register. They wanted to know not what the source looked like, but what it was, not the image, but the principle. And in the asking, something happened that would shape the next 25 centuries of Western thought. The maternal imagery of origin began to recede, and the search for an abstract first principle began to take its place. But not entirely, not yet, and not without the maternal shape leaving its trace in the abstractions that followed. Anaximander of Miletus was a man of the 6th century BCE who thought about water. He began from the work of his teacher Thales, who had proposed that the first principle of everything was water, not water as a symbol, but water as the actual stuff of which all things are made, in different forms and densities and transformations. Anaximander found this unsatisfying, not because the principle was wrong to be a fluid, formless, all-containing thing, but because water was still something specific, still a particular element among others, still a thing that had limits and a nature. What he wanted was something prior to all specific things, something that contained the possibility of all things without being any one of them. He called it the asterisk aperon asterisk, the boundless, the indefinite. The word resists translation the way that some Greek philosophical terms resist it, not because the Greek is unclear, but because what it names keeps exceeding the available English containers. The asterisk aperon asterisk is not the infinite in the mathematical sense, though that is close. It is not the void, though it shares some qualities with that. It is not matter, though matter arises from it. It is, Anaximander said, the source from which all things arise, and the destination to which all things return when they perish, the surrounding medium that holds the cosmos in its interior, the way that darkness holds the spaces between stars, not by containing them in a vessel, but by being the condition of there being space at all. There is a fragment, possibly the oldest surviving sentence of Western philosophy, that is attributed to Anaximander, that things return to the source from which they came, paying penalty and recompense for their injustice according to the order of time. The fragment is disputed and has been translated many ways. What it seems to say is that individual things arise from the boundless, exist for a time as distinct and separate, and then return, and that the returning is not punishment, but completion, the closing of a cycle that was always going to close. The individual thing, in Anaximander's account, does not disappear. It returns to what was always already larger than it. Standing at the edge of the Aegean, watching the water that his teacher had taken for the first principle, Anaximander would have been thinking past the water to what the water itself arose from, not the ocean, not any element, something prior to all elements, surrounding them, the way darkness surrounds a lamp, inexhaustible and patient, and in no hurry to resolve itself into any particular form. Later readers, including scholars who worked at the intersection of classical philosophy and depth psychology, saw in the **** the same intuition that Hesiod had dressed in the name Gaia and the image of a generating body, the intuition that the ground of all things is formless, boundless, and ultimately reclaiming of all that arises from it. The name had changed, the abstraction had increased, but the shape of the thought, the maternal shape, had not entirely left. The thing that is boundless does not abandon what arises from it. It waits. The thought developed differently across the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, passing through hands that gave it new architectures and new urgencies. When Plato came to it in his late work, he came to it with the problem of the cosmos, not just the ground of all things in the abstract, but the specific question of how this particular ordered world came to be. The dialogue he wrote for this was the Timaeus asterisk, a difficult and strange text that sits at the edge of Plato's philosophy and does not quite fit the containers that work for his other dialogues. In it, a character named Timaeus proposes a cosmogony, an account of how the cosmos was made, and the account involves 3 things: the forms, which are eternal and unchanging patterns of which all things are imperfect copies; the craftsman, or demiurge, who uses the forms as a pattern and makes the world according to them; and a third thing, without which neither the craftsman nor the forms are sufficient to explain how the world actually exists. The third thing is the one that matters here. Plato called it the hypodosh, the receptacle, or sometimes the nurse of becoming, or sometimes, and this is the word he reached for when the other words ran out, the mother. Plato was not careless with language. When he settled on the word mother for the receptacle, he did so knowing its weight. The receptacle, in his account, is the space or medium in which the cosmos takes shape, not a container in the sense of a box or a vessel, but something prior to the distinction between container and contained, something that receives the impressions of the forms, the way that gold receives the shape of the die pressed into it, without having any shape of its own. It has no quality, it has no color, it has no definite nature. It is, Plato says, entirely neutral with respect to whatever is placed within it, the way that a mirror has no content of its own, but reflects whatever faces it. Plato searched for this description carefully, and the searching is visible in the text. He circled the receptacle with analogies. It is like a wax tablet before anything is written on it, like a soft substance that takes impressions, and none of the analogies were quite right, and he said so. He tried the word mother and then kept it, not because it was perfect, but because it was the closest available approximation to something that resisted the exactness he preferred. A mother, in the biological and philosophical understanding of his time, was the recipient of the seed, the passive ground in which the active principle worked, the material cause, as Aristotle would later systematize it, in contrast to the formal and efficient causes that were associated with the masculine and the rational. Plato's choice of the word was not incidental. The receptacle is the maternal ground of the cosmos, the formless precondition of all form, the dark and all-receiving medium in which the ordered world takes shape. Philosophers who came later found in this passage one of the most telling moments in the history of Western thought. Plato, who had built a philosophy of forms, eternal, rational, intelligible, associated throughout his dialogues with light and ascent and the masculine mind's climb toward truth, found, when he came to explain how the world actually exists, that he needed a third thing that was none of those things. It was dark, it was formless, it was prior to rational order. It was not something the mind could look at directly. As one looks at a form, he says explicitly that the receptacle is apprehended by a kind of bastard reasoning, not the clear intellectual intuition he elsewhere associates with philosophical knowledge. It was known sideways, felt more than grasped, more like the ground beneath the feet than the sun seen with the eyes. He called it the mother, and in doing so he acknowledged something that his philosophy of forms had not quite prepared him to acknowledge, that at the foundation of the ordered, rational, intelligible cosmos is a formless, receptive, indefinite ground that precedes and exceeds the order that arises within it. He gave it the word for the most fundamental, generative relationship he knew. He did not celebrate it. He gave it its due and moved on, returning to the forms and the craftsman and the account of cosmic order that was more comfortable ground for him. But the acknowledgment was made. The maternal ground was named, however briefly, in the heart of his cosmogony. The same dialogue contained another figure who would become, in the hands of later philosophers, the most philosophically elaborate expression of the maternal principle in the ancient tradition. Plato described the world's soul, the asterisk psyche tou, cosmo asterisk, as the great mediating presence that connects the eternal realm of the forms to the world of temporal, changing, material existence. She was not quite a goddess in the theogony's sense, and she was not quite an abstraction in the way that a mathematical principle is an abstraction. She was something between a rational, living, self-moving principle stretched across the cosmos, whose circular self-contemplation was the source of the ordered motions of the heavens. Plato described her construction with unusual precision. The craftsman blended three kinds of being, the same, the different, and existence itself, to make the fabric of her soul, and then divided and arranged this fabric into the circular bands whose motions would become the orbits of the planets. She was, in a sense, the cosmos's own capacity for self-understanding, the mind of the universe gazing at the intelligible patterns of which it was an expression. But she was also generative, a principle of becoming as much as of knowing, the medium through which the eternal forms became manifest in temporal, spatial, material form. She was both rational and maternal in a way that later philosophers found inexhaustible. Plotinus, in the 3rd century CE, received this description and developed it into something vast and patient. The world's soul, in his account, perpetually generates temporal existence by gazing downward toward matter, while gazing upward toward the higher intelligence that contemplates the forms. She is, he said, like a sleeping woman who generates images while she sleeps, the cosmos the dream of a soul whose deeper attention is elsewhere. She does not work at her creation. She simply is, and what she is overflows into the world, the way that warmth overflows from a fire without the fire diminishing, the generations of temporal existence, the seasons, the births and deaths, the long, slow movements of natural process are the expressions of her contemplative life, the outer surface of an interior that is always facing the light. The Pythagoreans, who were working in a different register entirely, arrived at a related position from a different direction. In their account, as Aristotle later reconstructed it, and as thinkers like Iamblichus elaborated, the fundamental structure of reality involved a polarity between two principles, the monad and the dyad, the one and the two. The monad was the principle of limit, determination, unity, the definite, associated in their symbolic language with light, with the masculine, with the rational, and the formed. The dyad was its counterpart, the principle of the unlimited, the indefinite, the formless generative ground from which all numbered things poured forth. The dyad was not an absence, it was not merely the negation of the monad. It was, in their account, the teeming generative, all-containing matrix from which all specific forms arose, the womb of number, the limitless ground of every determined thing. In a room lit by oil lamps in Croton or Tarentum or one of the other cities where Pythagorean communities gathered in the 5th century BCE, men and women, the tradition included both, discussed these principles with a seriousness that was also a kind of devotion. The monad was the beginning, and the dyad was the condition of the monad's becoming anything more than itself. Every number from 3 onward required both of them. Every form required the formless to give it room. Every specific, bounded, determined thing required the unbounded to have somewhere to be. The feminine ground of mathematics itself, they held, presided silently over every theorem, not as a mystical afterthought, but as the philosophical precondition of precision. There is something in this that resists the easy narrative in which Greek philosophy represents a turn away from mythological and feminine ways of understanding toward the clarity of male-dominated rational thought. That narrative is not entirely wrong, but it misses how thoroughly the philosophical work kept returning to something it could not account for within its explicit frameworks, a ground that was prior to the order it was trying to describe, a formless matrix that was more fundamental than any of the forms it was generating, a receptive depth, without which neither the rational arguments nor the mathematical structures had anywhere to stand. The reading of these texts that made this visible came from directions that were sometimes unexpected. Jacques Derrida, working in the 20th century with the very different tools of philosophical deconstruction, turned his attention to the passage in the asterisk, Timaeus asterisk, about the receptacle, and found there a philosophical moment of considerable complexity. Plato, Derrida argued, had needed the receptacle in order to complete his cosmological argument, but he had been unable to give it the kind of philosophical status he gave to the forms. It could not be known in the same way. It could not be named with the same precision. It was, by Plato's own account, known through a bastard reasoning, through something less than the full clarity of philosophical cognition, and so Plato named it and moved on, without fully integrating what he had named into the architecture of his philosophy. This is described not as Plato's failure, but as a moment of philosophical honesty, the place where a great systematic philosopher arrived at the edge of his system and acknowledged, by reaching for the word mother, that something beyond the system was doing the work the system depended on. The acknowledgement is quiet, it is not developed. It is given a few paragraphs, and then the dialogue moves on. But it is there, in one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, the maternal ground, receiving its name and then receding again into the dark from which it had briefly and briefly only emerged. Luce Irrigare, thinking about this passage and others like it, described the philosophical tradition's relationship to the feminine ground as one of simultaneous dependence and exclusion, a structure in which the maternal is necessary at the foundation but systematically denied a voice in what is built upon it. This reading is presented not as a verdict on the tradition, but as an observation about a pattern that the tradition itself, read carefully, makes visible. The philosophers needed the ground. They could not do without the formless matrix, the receptive depth, the all-containing prior that made their orderly structures possible, and they tended, having acknowledged it, to move back toward the light, toward the forms, the craftsman, the world soul in her more rational and solar aspects, leaving the maternal ground in the position it had occupied since Gaia gave birth to the sky, and the sky blocked the light from the earth below. What is notable, holding all of this together in a single quiet attention, is not the exclusion, but the persistence. Gaia had been there before Hesiod gave her a name in the dark. Anaximanders, *Aperon, kept the shape of the maternal, even when it shed the imagery. Plato's receptacle arrived in the middle of a philosophy of rational forms, and refused to be reduced to them. The Pythagorean dyad sat at the foundation of their mathematical cosmology, and kept the formless there as a positive principle, something kept returning, not because later philosophers were consciously continuing an earlier tradition, not because there was a deliberate philosophical project of preserving the maternal ground, but because the question of origin kept leading back to it, and the attempt to describe the ground of all things kept encountering something that the available concepts for rational and formal and determined being could not quite hold. When Plato reached for the word mother, he was not making a concession. He was, for a moment, telling the truth about what the argument required. The mother was not a metaphor he was using to make the abstract more accessible. She was the name he gave to something his philosophy had no other name for, the dark, formless, all-receiving ground from which even the most ordered and rational cosmos arose, and into which it would, in time, return. The words sat in the text in the middle of a dialogue about astronomy and geometry and the mathematical structure of the cosmos, surrounded by precise technical vocabulary and careful logical argument. It sat there the way that a very old and quiet thing sometimes sits inside a modern room, present, self-contained, not quite belonging to the furniture around it, not quite belonging to any era in particular, simply there, holding what it has always held. Philosophy carried this forward in ways that were not always visible on the surface. The elaborate Neoplatonic hierarchies of being, one, mind, soul, organized the cosmos into a descending series of emanations, each level less unified and more multiple than the one above it, and at the base of the descent was matter, which was not quite nothing, but was so far from the original unity of the one that it approached the characterless, the formless, the dark. Matter in this account was not evil. It was simply the outermost edge of being, the furthest point of the one self-expression, before the expression faded into what was, philosophically speaking, the equivalent of silence. Some Neoplatonists described matter as a kind of shadow, not a substance but the image of a substance, the dark reverse face of form. Others described it as a receptive principle, passive and all-containing, that gave the forms of higher being somewhere to appear. In all of these accounts, the maternal shape kept returning. The further down one went in the hierarchy of being, the more formless and all-containing the territory became. The depths held. The depths received. The depths were, by most definitions, prior, They had to be there before anything else could take shape within them. The philosophy of emanation was also read from the bottom rather than the top, a philosophy of maternal ground. These were not positions that required one to believe in Gaia or in any other figure. They were structural observations about the way that philosophical accounts of origin keep arriving at something formless and prior that cannot be fully contained within the conceptual vocabulary of form and reason. The observation has been made in the context of ancient cosmogony, in the context of Pythagorean mathematics, in the context of Platonic metaphysics, in the context of Neoplatonic theology. Each time the argument has pushed far enough toward the question of origin, it has arrived at something that the available formal vocabulary was not quite equipped to name, and the word that tended to arrive in the reaching was the word for the figure who is present before presence begins. The field in Boeotia, where Hesiod stood, is still there, under other names. The Aegean that Anaximander watched while thinking past the water to what the water arose from is still reflecting the same light it reflected then. The dialogue that Plato wrote while searching for the word that would name the receptacle is still in the libraries, still being read, still arriving at the same passage where the philosopher pauses and reaches and settles with evident reluctance and evident honesty on the word that says the most and still does not say enough. The word mother sits there in the middle of one of the most rigorous philosophical texts the ancient world produced. It is surrounded by geometry. It is embedded in an account of cosmic construction so precise that later scholars spent centuries debating its mathematical implications. And it is the word Plato used when the argument required him to name the ground of all things, to name the formless medium that receives the forms of rational order, to name the thing without which neither the craftsman nor the forms could make a world that actually exists. There is a patience in this observation. Philosophy has been carrying the maternal ground at its foundations for as long as it has existed, sometimes acknowledging it, more often moving past it with a kind of urgency that suggests it is not entirely comfortable there. The acknowledgement, when it comes, tends to be brief. The word is placed, the concept is gestured at, and the philosopher returns to the clearer ground of formal and rational analysis. But the ground remains. The formless, all-receiving, boundless, generative depth remains beneath every ordered structure, beneath every logical argument, beneath every geometric cosmology, as it remained beneath the temple at Delphi after Apollo had taken the shrine. What Plato reached for and found and could not quite hold, the word that said too much and not quite enough, the name that was both the closest approximation and an acknowledgement of the distance that still remained. That word rests now in the long silence of the text, not as a problem awaiting solution, not as a gap in the philosophical architecture that later thought has been building toward filling, simply as a place where the argument arrived at something older than the argument, and paused, and in the pausing named it, and in the naming left it to go on being what it had always been, the ground that holds the weight of everything that stands upon it, patient and formless and dark and entire, waiting without urgency for thought to return to where it began. Plotinus was an old man when he dictated the words about the return. His eyesight had been failing for some time, and he worked by dictation in those later years, speaking slowly into the careful attention of his student Porphyry, who sat nearby with a wax tablet and a stylus, copying out what the philosopher said in a hand that would preserve it long after both of them were gone. The afternoon light in the Roman study was warm and then amber and then beginning to cool, and Plotinus spoke about the one, about the absolutely simple first principle from which everything flows. In the same unhurried voice a man might use to describe a landscape he has looked at for so long that it no longer requires effort, only attention. The tablet received the words described a return. What Plotinus was reaching toward in those dictations was not an argument exactly, though the arguments were precise and careful. It was more like a map of the whole of being, drawn from the inside. Reality, as he understood it, flows outward from a single source, so simple and so complete that it cannot even be said to act. It emanates, the way a fire gives warmth without choosing to, the way the sun casts light without deliberating over it. From this source flows Nous, the divine intellect, the pure contemplation of all possible forms. From Nous flows the world soul, the great maternal intermediary, the living principle that binds eternal form to temporal existence and keeps the structure of the cosmos coherent from moment to moment. And from the world soul, at the outermost reach of this emanation, flow individual souls, each one a fragment of the world soul, each one carrying, however distantly, the luminous signature of the source from which it came. The individual soul has descended. That is the condition Plotinus acknowledges, not as a tragedy, but as a fact about where the soul presently finds itself, the way a traveler might acknowledge the distance from home without distress. The soul is here, in a body, in time, in the world of particular and changing things, but it carries something with it. There is a higher part of the soul, Plotinus insisted, that never fully leaves the divine realm, a part that remains, even now, in contact with the world soul, the way the root of a plant remains in the earth, even when the stem and flower have grown far above it. The descent has not severed the connection, it has only placed a distance between the soul and what it came from, a distance that philosophical labor, the long, patient turning of attention back toward the source, can slowly, very slowly, begin to close. The world soul in Plotinus is not exactly a goddess, though the language around her accumulates something of that quality. She is the principle that gives birth to time. She contemplates the eternal forms, and her contemplation generates the material cosmos, the way a thought, held long enough, takes on weight and form. She is always in two directions at once, gazing upward toward Nous and the One, and giving rise downward to the temporal world, the great maternal intermediary, who is never fully in either place, and who is, by that position, the hinge on which all of being turns. Later philosophers in the Neoplatonic tradition, Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, would return to her again and again, elaborating and debating, but always around the same center, the world soul, as the vast, life-giving, mediating feminine that holds the cosmos together from within. Porphyry, who took down Plotinus's words and later organized them into the 6 groups of 9 that make up the Enneads, wrote his own account of the soul's descent. He was a careful and wide-ranging scholar, and among the texts he took seriously was a passage from Homer, 12 lines in the 13th book of the Odyssey, brief enough to pass unnoticed, describing a cave on the island of Ithaca where nymphs weave at stone looms and bees store their honey, a cave with 2 entrances. One entrance faces north, toward the cold. One faces south, toward the warm light. The northern entrance is for mortals descending. The southern is for the gods. 12 lines. Porphyry spent an entire treatise on them. What he found in the cave was a complete philosophy of the soul. The cave itself, he argued, is the material world, dark, watery, enclosed, the place where souls enter bodies and begin the long work of mortal existence. It is the image of a womb. The nymphs who weave within it are weaving the mortal bodies that incarnating souls will inhabit, their looms threaded with the substance of material life. The honey the bees bring in is the sweetness that draws the soul into incarnation, the pleasures and attachments that make embodied existence compelling, the things that make it difficult to remember where one came from. And the two entrances define the complete arc of the soul's journey. The northern opening, dark and cold, is the way of descent into matter and generation. The southern opening, warm and light, is the way of return, the path of ascent for souls that have done the work of purification and are ready to move back toward their origin. The cave in Homer is a small thing, a landscape detail. Porphyry is not forcing it, or rather, he believes he is not, because for him, the ancient poets encoded in their images a theology so complete and precise that to read them allegorically is not to distort them, but to find what was always there. Whether or not one shares that conviction, the image he drew out of the Odyssey is worth holding for a moment. The dark interior space, as the place souls go when they enter time, the two entrances as the poles of a vast cycle, the return journey already built into the structure of the same cave through which descent occurred. The way out and the way in are not different caves. They are two openings in the same maternal interior. The soul, for Porphyry, is not lost in the cave. It is in a place with a structure, a place that, if followed attentively, leads somewhere. The southern entrance exists. The ascent is possible. What the soul requires is not escape, so much as orientation, the willingness to stop being absorbed in the weaving and the honey, and to begin the slow turn toward the light. Plotinus called the soul's return the flight of the alone to the alone. The phrase has stayed in the philosophical tradition for 17 centuries, not because it resolves anything, but because it names something that those who have encountered it recognize, the quality of a certain kind of inward movement, the soul becoming very quiet and very still, and finding that at the bottom of that stillness, something vast and simple is already there, waiting, having always been there, and the reaching toward it is less an act of will than a relaxation of the effort that had been keeping one away. The alone here is not loneliness, it is simplicity, the soul stripped of what is not essential. The one that it is reaching toward is also simple in that way, but a simplicity so total that it exceeds everything the mind can form a concept of, a simplicity that Plotinus can only gesture toward and never quite say. What is maternal about this return is not a feeling Plotinus insists upon, but it is present in the structure of what he describes. The soul comes from a source. It moves outward into the world of particular, distinct, bounded things, and it can, with patience and long philosophical labor, begin to move back. The source it returns to is not a thing among other things, but the condition of all things, prior to form, prior to boundary, prior to the distinctions that make individual existence feel solid and defined. To move back toward the one is to move toward something that holds everything, that has no outside, that the soul cannot approach from a distance, because there is nowhere from which it is not already surrounded by it. The return is less a journey toward than a recognition of what was never absent. Porphyry had studied with Plotinus for 6 years before his teacher died, and he carried that teaching into his own long life with the particular fidelity of someone who has encountered something he does not expect to encounter again. But Porphyry was also a man of wide scholarly interests, and in reading the Greek philosophical tradition he had found, embedded in the Platonic account of the soul's descent, a question that would not leave him alone. If the soul's return requires philosophical contemplation, the sustained turning of intellectual attention toward the divine, then the return is available only to those with the education and the leisure to pursue philosophy. The cave, on this account, has a southern entrance, but not everyone has equal access to it. His younger contemporary Iamblichus had a different answer. Iamblichus was born in Syria and worked and taught there, a philosopher deeply rooted in the Platonic tradition, but convinced that Plotinus and Porphyry had misunderstood something important about the soul's condition and its possibilities. The argument, simply put, was this: the soul that has descended into matter is not a divine intelligence temporarily slumming in a body, capable of lifting itself back toward the divine by its own philosophical effort. The soul that has descended is genuinely here, genuinely in matter, genuinely affected by its embodiment, and because of this, philosophical contemplation alone is not enough. The soul cannot think its way back. Something more than thought is required. What Iamblichus proposed was theurgy. The word means something close to divine work or sacred action, the performance of specific rituals, the use of specific materials and sacred objects and invocations through which the gods act in and through the soul, rather than the soul acting toward the gods. The theurgist does not ascend by personal philosophical achievement. The theurgist creates the conditions in which the divine can descend, and in that descent, the soul is lifted. The initiative belongs to the divine, not to the philosopher. And what makes the theurgy possible, what gives the material world the capacity to carry divine action, is that matter itself, the physical world, the bodies of things, the substance of the cave, is shot through with divine traces, implanted by the gods at the moment of creation, traces that specific sacred practices can activate and bring to life. This matters for how the material world is understood. For Plotinus, matter is the lowest and most distant reach of emanation, the farthest point from the One, the place of greatest darkness and least being. It is not evil exactly, but it is the absence of light taken to its extreme. Iamblichus will not accept this. Matter has been touched by the divine in its very constitution. The cave is not merely the place of imprisonment. It is a sacred maternal body whose inner structure, properly known and properly engaged, is already oriented toward the divine that made it. To work with that sacred structure is not to remain in the cave. It is to discover that the cave was always already suffused with what the ascending soul was seeking. The return is accomplished not by leaving the body, but by waking to what the body, in its divine origin, already contains. The disagreement between Porphyry and Iamblichus is precise and respectful, and, in the way of genuinely important philosophical disagreements, has never been definitively resolved. Porphyry's position preserves the soul's dignity as a divine being capable of philosophical self-elevation. Iamblichus's position preserves the soul's honesty about its actual embodied condition. Both of them are reading the same tradition. Both of them are asking the same question: where is the southern entrance, and how does one find it? They answer differently, and both answers carry weight. In the 2nd century CE, some decades before Plotinus was born, the city of Alexandria was one of the intellectual crossroads of the world, and within it, a range of philosophical and religious movements were working out their accounts of the same fundamental questions about soul, matter, descent, and return. Among these were the Gnostics, a loose and varied collection of teachers and communities united less by a common doctrine than by a shared conviction that the material world was not the world as it should be, and that the divine spark within each human being could, under the right conditions, be recognized and returned to its source. Among the Gnostic accounts of the cosmos One figure appears again and again, with a consistency that suggests she is touching something deep in the tradition's imaginary. Sophia. Sophia is the divine feminine aeon, one of the emanated principles within the divine pleroma, the fullness of divine being, and in the Gnostic cosmological accounts, Sophia is the one who falls. The accounts vary in their details, but the central movement is consistent. Something in Sophia, a passion, an unauthorized longing, a desire to know or to create without a proper counterpart, leads her to reach beyond herself, to initiate an action that takes her outside the divine order. What falls from her, what is generated by this unauthorized longing, becomes the flawed material world, the demiurge, the inferior divine craftsman who shapes the material cosmos in these accounts, is born from Sophia's fall, and the world he makes is marked by the incompleteness and the longing of its origin. Sophia is the mother of the fallen cosmos. This is stated as a fact in the Gnostic tradition, and it is the fact that gives the tradition its peculiar emotional texture. The material world as something that arose from an act of love that exceeded its proper boundaries. The cosmos as a place suffused with divine longing, precisely because the mother who gave rise to it was herself reaching for something she had not yet found. The sparks of divine light that are scattered through the material world, present in every conscious being as a warmth that does not belong entirely to this world. These are fragments of Sophia, traces of what fell with her, the divine that is present in matter, because the mother who generated it was herself divine. And Sophia does not simply remain fallen. The Gnostic soteriology, the teaching about how the divine sparks are saved or returned, is a narrative of recognition and gathering. The scattered light recognizes itself. The pneumatic soul, the soul that carries the divine spark, begins to recall what it is and where it came from. The gathering of this scattered light, the recollection of the Sophia fragments from the material world back into the divine pleroma, is what the Gnostic project is ultimately about. The savior figure in these accounts is not so much conquering a world as gathering a mother, Valentinus, who taught in Rome and Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, developed a version of this cosmological vision that was, in its way, extraordinarily careful. His account of the pleroma, the divine fullness, the great ordered community of aeons, is detailed and elaborate, a map of the divine realm in which every principle has its proper place and its proper counterpart. Sophia's longing, in his system, disturbs this order, not through malice, but through an excess of love, a passionate reaching that moves faster than wisdom can follow. The world that arises from this reaching is flawed and longing, but it is not abandoned. The light that fell into it is real light. The pneumatic soul that finds itself in this world of imperfect forms and restless change carries a genuine fragment of the divine fullness, and this fragment can be recognized, cultivated, and ultimately returned. What Valentinus was offering his listeners was a way of understanding their own homesickness, the sense, familiar to many of them, of being somewhere that is not quite home, of carrying within themselves a warmth that exceeds anything the world around them can fully answer. In his teaching, that feeling is not sentimental or confused. It is philosophically precise. The longing that cannot be satisfied by any particular object in the world is the pneumatic spark, recognizing, through the fog of its embodiment, the direction of its origin. It is Sophia, in miniature, still reaching. The teaching does not promise that the material world will become home. It promises that the reaching has a destination, and that the destination is real, and that the scattered fragments of the Divine Mother are, even now, in the slow process of being gathered back. There is a quality in the Gnostic vision that is difficult to translate cleanly into Neoplatonic terms, and yet deeply consonant with them, a sense that the present condition of the soul, however far it finds itself from its source, is not a place without meaning or without orientation. The distance is real, the darkness is real, but the light that the soul carries is real too, and it is directional. It knows in whatever dim way which way is home. In Porphyry's allegory of the cave, the soul that has descended through the northern entrance is genuinely in the cave. It is weaving and sleeping and tasting honey and doing all the things that souls and bodies do. But the southern entrance exists. It has always existed. The structure of the cave includes the way out, because the structure of the cave was made by the same principles that made everything else, and those principles are ultimately oriented toward their own source. The cave is not a trap. It is a passage with two openings, and one of them faces the warm light. The Neoplatonic soul and the Gnostic spark share this quality. They are not merely here, they are from somewhere, and that somewhere is not irrelevant to what they are and what is possible for them. The descent into embodiment, into time, into the cave of the material world, this descent is real and has genuine effects, genuine weight, genuine obscuring power. But it does not sever, it distances. And what philosophy, or theurgy, or the patient recollection of scattered light can accomplish is not the creation of a new connection, but the gradual clearing of what obscures the connection that has always been present. Plotinus, near the end of his life, is said to have described his own experience of this return, not the philosophical argument for it, but the lived moment of it, as a condition of perfect simplicity, a stillness so complete that for the duration of it there was no remainder, no distance, no sense of anything that needed to be added or taken away. Porphyry recorded that his teacher had these experiences several times in the years Porphyry knew him. He described them with the careful neutrality of a witness, reporting something that falls outside the usual categories, something that cannot quite be fitted into the standard vocabulary of philosophical description. Plotinus himself wrote about them in the Enneads as the goal toward which the whole of the philosophical life was oriented, the flight of the alone to the alone, the soul returning to the source that is not a location but the condition of all locations, the home that was never not present. The lamps in the Roman study burned down. Porphyry turned to a fresh tablet. The dictation continued. What Iamblichus added to this account from his Syrian study a generation later was a kind of tenderness toward matter that the Plotinian system did not quite permit. If the divine traces are genuinely present in material things, in stones, in plants, in the bodies of living creatures, in the substance of the world that the soul inhabits, then the soul's engagement with the material world is not simply a distraction from the philosophical ascent, but a potential vehicle of it. The sacred ritual that theurgy performs works precisely by finding and activating these divine traces, by treating the material world not as mere darkness, but as a dark room full of things that carry light, things that properly approached can participate in the soul's return. The body is not the enemy. The cave has windows, if one knows where to look. This is a quieter radicalism than Gnostic urgency, but it runs deep. It means that the soul's present condition, embodied, in time, in the world of particular and changing things, is not simply a departure from the sacred, but a location within it. The divine is here too, not in the way the Neoplatonic tradition sometimes suggested, as a faint and distant echo of what was left behind, but as a genuine presence woven into the fabric of material existence, present in the world's capacity to respond to the right kind of attention. The cave of the nymphs is dark. But the nymphs are weaving, and what they weave has its own beauty, its own intricate order, its own participation in the patterns that flow from the source of everything. To sit in the cave and watch the weaving in the right spirit is not to be distracted from the ascent. It is to begin to see that the weaving and the ascending are not entirely different movements. Both of them are responses to the same thing, the pull of the source, the maternal ground of being, drawing everything that arose from it back toward itself in the slow, unhurried way that very large things move. Plotinus described the one as something the soul does not approach from outside but recognizes from within, the way a note of music heard at the right moment opens out into the resonance that has always been present beneath all sound. The return is less a journey than a listening. The effort is not toward but inward, and the direction of inward and the direction of the source are at a certain depth the same direction. Porphyry's cave has two openings. The southern one faces the light, but the cave itself, the dark, watery, enclosed interior where the soul finds itself at present, is not without structure, not without beauty, not without the quiet movement of things that know, in their own way, what they are part of. The nymphs weave at their stone looms. The bees move slowly through the cave's interior. The honey accumulates in its comb, unhurried and sweet. These images are not arguments. They are orientations, ways of holding the soul's present condition that keep it legible as a moment within a larger arc rather than a place of simple exile. The descent was real. The embodiment is real. The distance from the source is real, and the philosophical tradition does not pretend otherwise. But the structure of that descent includes a return. The arc of the world soul's emanation carries within it the possibility of the soul's reascent, the way a wave carries within it, from the beginning, the shape of its return to shore. Somewhere in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, a Valentinian community read aloud from texts that described the pleroma as a great fullness and the material world as a temporary distance from it, a longing shaped into a cosmos. The lamplight was unsteady. The stone floor of the room they met in was cold. Outside, the city was going about its business. Inside, the recitation moved through its account of Sophia's reaching, Sophia's fall, the scattering of divine light through the world that arose from her longing, and the gathering of that light, slow and incomplete as yet, but underway. The listeners understood their own homesickness as part of this. They understood the warmth they carried, the warmth that no particular object in the world had ever quite answered, as Sophia in them, still reaching, still oriented toward the fullness she had come from. The night outside the cave deepens. The world soul, in Plotinus's account, does not sleep. She gazes perpetually in two directions, toward the eternal and toward the temporal, holding the cosmos in the light of her double attention, the great maternal intermediary who keeps everything coherent simply by being what she is, the living thread between what is unchanging and what changes, between what is eternal and what flows. The philosopher in his study has set down the lamp. The tablet is full. Tomorrow Porphyry will copy out what was said today in a cleaner hand, and the words will move one step closer to the form in which they will survive. Tonight, the cave is what it is, dark, enclosed, full of the quiet industry of the nymphs, the patient movement of the bees. The two entrances stand open to the night air. One faces north, where the cold comes from. One faces south, toward the slow warmth that, even now, even in the deepest part of the night, is already beginning to return. The soul that descended through the northern opening has been in the cave a long time. It has done its weaving. It has tasted the honey. It has grown familiar with the darkness in the way that one grows familiar with any dwelling, knowing its particular qualities of warmth, its particular quality of silence, the way sound moves through it, the way the air feels at different times of day. The cave has become, in a certain sense, home, not the true home, not the source, but a home nonetheless, a place where the soul has learned the particular forms that embodied existence takes, and has carried, through all of it, the luminous thread that connects it to what it came from. The southern entrance is there. It has always been there. Plotinus could find it in thought, in the long patient turning of philosophical attention inward and upward, until the effort dropped away, and what remained was simple and vast and complete. Iamblichus could find it in the sacred action, the theurgy that invites the divine to descend into matter and lift the soul along with it. The Valentinian community in Alexandria could find it in the recognition, sudden or gradual, it does not matter, that the homesickness they carried was not a deficiency, but a direction, the pneumatic spark orientating itself toward the pleroma, from which Sophia's longing had scattered it. The directions are different. The destination, in each account, is the same. The return to the maternal ground of all being, the source from which the soul descended, and toward which, in its own time and in its own way, it is already, even now, slowly turning. The cave holds the sleeping soul with the patience of something that has always been here. The nymphs weave without hurry. The honey is laid up in its comb, still and sweet and dark. Outside, the night is very deep and very quiet, and the two entrances of the cave stand open, one toward the cold, one toward the warmth, and the warmth on the southern side is something the sleeping soul already knows, already carries, already is turning toward, without quite knowing it, in the slow, unhurried way that very deep things move. At Eleusis, on the rocky coast west of Athens, there is a stone threshold that has not moved in 2,000 years. It marks the entrance to the inner sanctuary, the Anakteron, where the most sacred part of the mysteries took place. The limestone is pale, almost white in torchlight, and its surface is worn in the particular way that stone wears when an enormous number of feet have crossed the same place, in the same direction, over a very long time, not polished, softened, the edges of the stone rounded not by water, but by passage, by the accumulated weight of every pilgrim who approached that threshold in the dark, paused for a moment at the boundary between the ordinary world and whatever was waiting on the other side, and then went through. For nearly 2,000 years, initiates made that crossing. They came from across the Greek world, and later from across the Roman world. Farmers and senators, philosophers and fishermen, people whose names have been kept, and people whose names are entirely lost. They fasted. They walked the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis, carrying torches. They drank a grain-infused mixture called the Kakion, and entered the hall in darkness. What they experienced inside, the epoptea, the highest seeing, they were forbidden to describe. The prohibition held almost perfectly for the entire span of the mysteries. No account survives of what happened within. What does survive is the testimony in scattered fragments of ancient writing of what the experience produced, not in theological language, not in the abstract vocabulary of doctrine, but in the language of transformation, of having moved through something, of having been changed in a way that made the word death feel different afterward. The myth that the mysteries enacted was the story of Demeter and Persephone. It is told in full in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, composed somewhere around the 7th century before the Common Era, and its shape is simple in the way that the most enduring things tend to be simple. Persephone, gathering flowers in a meadow, is drawn downward into the earth. She descends into the realm of the dead. Her mother Demeter searches for her with a grief so absolute that the earth stops producing. The grain dies. The animals do not breed. The world enters a kind of suspension, a held breath, waiting. And then Persephone returns. Not entirely. She has eaten pomegranate seeds in the underworld, and so the descent and return become a rhythm rather than a single event, returning each year into the light, while carrying within her the knowledge of what lies in the dark below. The Eleusinian initiates understood themselves to be enacting this cycle, descent and return, the movement downward through the maternal dark, and the emergence that follows. The mythologist Erich Neumann argued that what the mysteries were enacting was not merely the agricultural cycle, though that was present too, but the soul's own developmental arc, the necessity of the descent, the necessity of contact with the maternal ground below ordinary consciousness, as the condition of a maturity that the surface life alone cannot provide. The initiate who crossed that worn stone threshold was crossing into an experience of what the soul already knew about itself. The fear of death, which the mysteries were widely reported to dissolve, was not defeated by an argument. It was dissolved by an experience. By having moved through the maternal dark and found that it held, the stone threshold at Eleusis is still there. It is not dramatic in itself, just a pale rectangle of ancient limestone set into the ground of an archaeological site on the Aegean coast. But when a hand is placed near its worn surface and its smoothness is attended to, something of the accumulated weight of all those crossings is still present in it, the oldest form of the mysteries, and the newest. The passage that was enacted so many times it became permanent in the stone. Persephone's descent is the oldest known example of the philosophical teaching that darkness is not opposed to life, but is its necessary precondition. She does not fall by accident. She does not return defeated. She returns changed, carrying within her a knowledge that the surface world cannot grant. The word the Greeks used for this kind of knowing, the knowledge that comes from having passed through, was not the same word they used for knowledge derived from observation or argument. It was experiential from the inside. It was the kind of knowing that cannot be handed to another person because it must be undergone. What the initiate carried back across that threshold was not information, but a new relationship with the maternal ground, an intimacy with the dark that made the light, afterward, feel less precarious. The labyrinth belongs to the same family of images. It appears in Neolithic rock carvings older than Eleusis, scratched into stone surfaces across Europe and the British Isles in patterns that have not yet been fully explained. It appears on Minoan seals and painted vessels from Crete, associated with the myth of the Minotaur at its center, the hero Theus entering the winding interior, armed with nothing but a sword and a thread. It appears in medieval cathedral floors, most famously at Chartres, where the great stone labyrinth set into the nave has been walked by pilgrims for 8 centuries, and is still walked today, the pattern worn slightly at its turnings, another threshold softened by passage. Neumann and the classical scholar W.F. Jackson Knight, working from different directions, both arrived at a similar understanding of what the labyrinth encodes: the winding passage, the surrender of the straight line, the willingness to turn and turn again, to lose the sense of forward direction, to trust the path without seeing the destination. They understood this as a symbolic rendering of the womb, not in a reductive sense, but in the sense that the labyrinth's logic is the logic of the maternal interior. It cannot be navigated by force. It cannot be shortened by will. The only way through is the way that is given. The center arrives not because the pilgrim has been clever, but because the pilgrim has been willing to keep walking, surrendering the ego's need to see the outcome in advance. A pilgrim in the nave church in the 13th century, setting a foot onto the first spiral of the great stone labyrinth, would have felt this surrender begin in the body before it arrived in the mind. The path curves immediately. The destination, the rose at the center, is visible from the entrance, but the path does not go toward it. It goes sideways, outward, across the full width of the nave, before curving back. Again and again the center appears to be near, and again the path turns away. The rational demand for efficiency must be released. The labyrinth will not respond to it. What it responds to is simply walking, turning when the path turns, trusting the stone beneath the feet to know where it is going. Medieval contemplatives understood this as a practice, not a spiritual exercise imposed from outside, but a direct enactment of something the soul already knows. The maternal interior of the sacred does not organize itself around the ego's preferred direction. It organizes itself around something older, slower, and more patient. Walking the labyrinth was understood as a kind of homecoming, not to a destination, but to a way of moving that the inner life had always been capable of and rarely allowed to enact. The center, when it arrived, was not triumphant. Pilgrims who reached the center of the charred labyrinth typically stayed there for a few minutes, standing quietly in the small rose-shaped space, and then turned and walked back out. The path of return exactly reversed the path of descent. The same turnings, the same apparent detours, the same patience required. Neumann saw in this the full arc of the soul's relationship with the maternal ground. The descent is not the point, and the center is not the point. The full movement, both directions, is the point, in and out again, through the maternal dark and back, changed not by what was found at the center, but by having moved through the entire circuit. Water holds a different quality in the Great Mother's symbolic vocabulary. Where the labyrinth is about passage and interiority, water is about dissolution, the softening of edges, the return to a state before distinct form. Jung observed that water is the element the unconscious reaches for most naturally, when it needs an image for itself. Dreams of still dark water below a surface, of immersion and floating, of the gradual loss of boundary between self and medium. These appear across cultures with a consistency that suggests something structural rather than incidental. The dreaming mind, reaching for an image of the maternal ground, tends to reach for water. The reason may be older than dreaming. Every individual life begins in water. The first experience any body has of the world is the warm, dark, enveloping medium of the amniotic chamber. Before sound is differentiated into language, before sensation becomes distinct enough to name, there is the fluid environment of the womb, the original maternal medium. Water remembers this. When water appears in a dream as vast and dark and still, the body recognizes something in it that the waking mind may not immediately place. The recognition is not intellectual. It is older than intellect. The sensation of being held, floating, weight relieved by warmth, edges softened, these are among the earliest physical experiences any consciousness has, and they remain encoded in the body long after memory, in the usual sense, has no access to them. This is what Jung and Neumann meant when they said that the loosening of ego boundaries in falling asleep is analogous to the soul's return to the watery maternal medium. They did not mean this as metaphor only. They meant that the nightly dissolution of waking consciousness, the softening of the edges that define the waking self, follows the same structural pattern as the soul's descent into the maternal ground. The water image is not a decoration applied to the process from outside. It is the process itself, recognized by the psyche in its own terms, which are always older than any philosophy made from them. The fairy tales hold the same knowledge, though they hold it in a different key. Baba Yaga, the great witch of the Slavic tradition, lives at the edge of the forest in a hut that stands on chicken legs. She is ancient beyond age. Her nose touches the ceiling when she sleeps. She eats travelers who cannot answer her riddles. She can also grant the young hero exactly what is needed, the magical object, the crucial knowledge, the direction that was previously unavailable. Everything depends on how the encounter is approached. She is not predictable. She is not safe, but she is not arbitrary either. Her tests are real tests. Her gifts are real gifts. And the young hero who meets her without flinching, who asks without begging, who serves without self-abasement, tends to pass through. Jungian analysts have understood Baba Yaga as a precise psychological figure, the shadow aspect of the Great Mother, given autonomous form in narrative. What the archetype carries that the Good Mother image does not: the consuming power, the unconditional demand, the readiness to devour what is not adequate to the encounter, Baba Yaga holds without apology. She is not the mother who nourishes and shelters. She is the mother who tests, and if the test is failed, ends the journey. Both faces belong to the same archetype: the warm cove and the open headland, the sheltering interior and the wild exposed shore. The fairy tale does not try to resolve the tension between them. It simply presents both, in sequence, as the structure of the soul's experience of the maternal ground across a life. Baba Yaga's hut is always imagined in a specific quality of stillness: torchlight through a small window, the smell of dark earth, the old woman sitting without urgency, without impatience, without any particular feeling about whether the traveler arrives or does not, survives or does not, succeeds or does not. She has been there a very long time. She will be there after. The patience is not warmth exactly, but it is not hostility either. It is the patience of something that has outlasted every urgency it has witnessed, that knows how long things take, because it has watched everything take as long as it takes. In her stillness, in the lamplight of that impossible hut at the edge of the forest, there is something that resembles what the deepest rest feels like. Not comfort in the usual sense, but the absolute suspension of the demand that things be otherwise. The counterpart of Baba Yaga in the fairy tale tradition, the wise woman, the fairy godmother, the helpful old woman at the crossroads, encodes the other face of the same inexhaustible figure. She appears when the young woman has done something unremarkable and kind, when the young man has treated a small creature with dignity. She offers a gift, a direction, a cloak of invisibility, a way through. She does not explain herself. Her gifts do not come with instructions. They come with the requirement that the hero trust what has been given and use it, which means knowing what is needed without being told. The fairy tale tradition seems to understand that the two faces of the mother, the one who demands and the one who gives, are in fact aspects of a single encounter with the maternal ground, separated by the story's architecture into two figures that appear in sequence, but belonging in a deeper sense to a single presence that holds both powers at once. Joseph Campbell spent the better part of his life tracing the great circle that holds all of this together. In his reading of the world's mythological inheritance, the hero's journey, departure, initiation, return, is the single story that every culture tells in its own voice, because it is the story the soul tells about itself. The hero leaves a known world, crosses a threshold, enters a realm of ordeal, transformation, the encounter with forces larger than the individual self, and then, if the journey goes well, returns, carrying what was found in the dark interior back into the world of ordinary life. Campbell was clear about the figure at the center of this arc, the mother, in her forms as goddess, as temptress, who offers the seduction of remaining in the underworld, as the sacred feminine intelligence that grants what the hero needs, as the queen of the underworld herself, is not peripheral to the journey. She is the journey's ground, its substance, its ultimate horizon. The separation from the mother is the departure. The meeting with the goddess in the depths is the central transformation. The return is a homecoming that finds the familiar world newly seen from inside the knowledge the dark has provided. What Campbell noticed and spent a long time describing is that the hero does not return to where the departure happened. The physical location may be the same, the faces may be the same, but the relationship to all of it has changed. The hero returns to the same home and finds it different because the home is now seen from the inside of the maternal knowledge rather than from the outside of it. The ground is recognized as ground. The ordinary things are ordinary in a new way, no longer merely familiar, but held in a recognition that includes the dark journey that led back to them. This is what the Eleusinian initiates discovered. The ordinary world re-entered after the knight's passage through the maternal dark, looked the same, and was not the same. Not because anything had been added to it, because something had been understood about what had always been carrying it. Campbell traced the circle of the hero's journey as a single unbroken line. It leaves a warm place, it crosses a first threshold, it enters a long dark arc that includes ordeal, encounter with the divine feminine in many forms, the supreme test, and the return threshold. The line arrives not where it began, but at the same place experienced from within the knowledge of the passage, the home recognized as maternal ground rather than mere location, the circle complete. And in the completeness of that circle, in the recognition that the line always curved back toward its origin, Campbell saw the most fundamental truth that mythology carries, that the soul's life is not a linear departure from origin, but a vast, slow circling around and through the source from which it came. Every individual life reenacts this circle in microcosm, and every single night in the smaller arc of sleep and waking, something of the same structure is present, the departure from waking consciousness, the crossing of a threshold, the entry into the maternal dark of dreaming and deep sleep, where the ego's edges soften and the images that arise are not made by will, but given by something deeper. And then, each morning, the return, the same face in the mirror, the same room, the same life, but held in a body that has crossed the threshold and come back, that has been in the dark and is here again, that has rested in the maternal ground and carries its nourishment forward without necessarily knowing the form it takes. Water, root, dream, return, these are not four separate things. They are four words for the same movement, approached from different angles. Water is the element that dissolves, that holds, that gives and takes form with equal willingness. Root is the part of the living thing that goes down into the dark, invisible, drawing from depths the surface never sees. Dream is the soul's nightly passage through the maternal interior, the images that arise from below, ordinary consciousness carrying messages from a depth the waking mind cannot access directly. Return is what each of these names, in its own way, the movement back toward origin that does not undo development, but completes it. The soul returns to the maternal ground, not only at death, and not only in the great arc of a life's development. it returns every night. This is the quiet philosophical teaching encoded in the biology of sleep, that the soul, which spends its waking hours moving through the world of distinct things, of separateness and differentiation, of ego and intention and direction, periodically releases all of that and sinks back into an undifferentiated warmth that is neither sleep nor waking, but something prior to both, the slow rhythmic breathing of deep sleep, the body heavy and still, the mind moving through images that are not of its own making. These are the signs that the return is underway, that the ego has relaxed its boundaries, that the maternal ground is doing what it always does when given the opportunity, holding, nourishing, restoring the capacity for tomorrow's waking. Jung, sitting late at night in his study at Kusnacht, with a patient's dream journal open in front of him, knew this. He had spent decades watching the unconscious produce images that no individual education could account for, ancient symbols surfacing in the dreams of people who had no access to the mythological traditions that had named them the Great Mother arising in water, and cave and dark feminine figure and forest threshold, the same image appearing in different people at different times, as if the psyche had one root, regardless of how many leaves it put out. He sat with this not as a problem requiring solution, but as a fact requiring understanding. Something in the human soul knows this ground. Something in the sleeping mind returns to it each night. Something in the body, receiving the weight of the bed below and the warmth of the blanket above, recognizes in that held stillness the oldest kind of holding. The archaeological record that Newman assembled in the early 1950s, spreading photographs of ancient goddess figurines across a wide table in Tel Aviv, Paleolithic carvings from Central Europe, painted vessels from Minoan Crete, stone figures worn smooth by 30,000 years of existence, suggested that the recognition is very old, older than writing, older than cities, older than any philosophy that has tried to name it. The human psyche, confronted with the mystery of its own origin, has been making the same image for longer than any other image it has made. The rounded, nourishing form, the holding shape, the figure that embodies the ground from which life arises and to which it returns. Each of those ancient figures was shaped by a specific pair of hands, in a specific moment, in a specific light. Firelight, most probably. The flicker of a small flame in a dark space. A person working with stone or clay, pressing form from formlessness, bringing to material existence an image of the source of all material existence. The paradox is quiet. The most primordial image of the formless ground was made by pressing form into matter, by the most concrete and individual act of creation available to human hands. The figure does not transcend the material. It is made of material. It is found in a cave floor or a riverbed, carried in a hand, held against a body. The Great Mother enters the world as a small, heavy, portable object that fits in a palm. This is what the Neoplatonists understood when Iamblichus insisted that the return of the soul to its divine origin required not only contemplation, but theurgy, sacred ritual, physical enactment, the engagement of matter as the vehicle of ascent. Matter is not the soul's prison. It is the maternal body through which the soul moves. The engagement with it, done with attention and with the understanding that the divine is present within rather than absent from material things, becomes the path rather than the obstacle. The worn stone at Eleusis, the stone figure in the palm, the labyrinth's cold floor beneath the feet. These are not metaphors for a purely interior process. They are the places where the interior process leaves its mark on the world, and where the world, through its material presence, marks the soul in return. The Eleusinian initiates walking back through that worn threshold, having spent the night in the maternal dark of the sanctuary, emerged into an early morning that was in every observable way the same morning as the one that had preceded their descent, the same light, the same sea, the same road back to Athens. The transformation was not in the world, it was in the relationship between the soul and the world, a shift that the philosopher Plotinus would have recognized as the difference between a soul that has turned toward its origin and a soul that has not a change of circumstance, a change in the quality of seeing. The ordinary world received by a soul that knows its ground is the ordinary world, exactly, held in a different light. Plotinus believed that the soul never entirely loses contact with its divine origin, even at the fullest depth of its descent into embodiment. The higher part of the soul, he wrote, always remains above. It has never actually separated from the One, the maternal source of all being. What the individual consciousness experiences as distance from the divine is not a true separation, but a failure of attention, an absorption in the lower movements of thought and sensation, so complete that the higher connection becomes inaudible, like a conversation happening in another room that cannot be heard over the noise of the immediate. The contemplative practice he advocated was not a journey towards something absent, but a quieting of the noise that made the already present connection inaudible. This has a quiet implication for everything that follows from it. The maternal ground does not need to be reached. It does not need to be earned or achieved or approached by some correctly followed path. It is already here, already present, already holding everything that arises from it. What happens in the soul's practices of descent and return, in the mysteries, in the labyrinth, in the fairy tale's dark forest passage, in the philosopher's long night of contemplation, in the ordinary nightly dissolution of waking consciousness into sleep, is not a movement towards something absent. It is a noticing of something that has never been away. The pressure of the ground, always present below, finally felt. The warmth that was always here, finally acknowledged as warmth. The body knows this before the mind does. This is what the Eleusinian initiates were discovering when they crossed that pale limestone threshold, and what the medieval pilgrim was discovering when the labyrinth's turning path surrendered the straight line, and what the fairy tale traveler was discovering in Baba Yaga's dark hut at the edge of the forest. Not a new fact, but a renewed recognition. The ground is there. It has always been there. The fear of the dark, the fear of descent, the fear of dissolution, these are fears of losing something that turns out on the other side of the passage to have been held rather than lost. The maternal ground does not take. It receives and holds and returns what it holds, changed only in the way that the labyrinth's pilgrim is changed, not by subtraction, but by the addition of an intimacy with the deep interior that the surface life alone cannot grant. The body lying still in the dark of a room, breath moving slowly in the chest, warmth gathered between body and blanket, and the weight of the bed below, this is the body in the act of that recognition, not consciously, necessarily, not in the form of a thought or a named understanding, but in the way the muscles gradually release, in the way the edges of the ordinary self begin to soften, in the way the images that arise are given rather than made, and carry a quality that even a brief dream of the most ordinary content somehow holds. The body knows. The maternal ground is close. It is in fact here already, pressing gently upward through the mattress, holding the weight it was always prepared to hold. The worn stone at Eleusis holds the memory of every crossing made across it, in both directions, descent and return. Every one of those pilgrim feet that wore the surface smooth, contributed to a record that the stone carries without knowing it carries anything. The limestone does not remember the specific initiates, the specific nights, the specific transformations that began with that one step from the torchlight of the ordinary world into the maternal dark of the sanctuary. It holds the aggregate weight of all of them, the long, slow pressure of passage, the accumulated intimacy of uncountable arrivals at the threshold. And the stone continues to be what it has always been: ground, that is, threshold, that is, the material boundary between what is familiar and what is vast and interior and dark, and in the end, the same thing seen from within. The sleeping body is the labyrinth's still center, not the destination of a journey completed, but the center of a circle that turns, even now, around its own deepest axis. The breath moves in and out with a patience that belongs to the body's own intelligence, slower than any intention could make it, carrying the rhythm of a cycle far older than this particular night. Warmth gathers in the space between the body and what holds it, a warmth that is not made, but accumulated, present before sleep, and deepening as sleep comes. The simple physical fact of being held from below while covered from above, pressed gently from both sides, into the stillness that has always been available at the center of the day's noise. The Great Mother does not announce herself in this moment. She is not a thought that arrives, or an image that forms, or a word that rises before the mind. She is the ground, exactly, present as ground is present, beneath everything, requiring nothing, holding the weight that falls into her with the patience of something that has been holding weight for a very long time. The thread that runs through all of this, through the worn threshold and the labyrinth's patient, turns, and the fairy tale's dark forest, and the philosopher's late lamp, and the ancient figure cradled in a palm, is the same thread, always, not progress toward a destination, not an argument arriving at a conclusion, a circle,